welcome to Biblical Perspectives with Frank and Chad. We are glad to be here with you for episode number 9 of season 2. We've been talking about the three angels' message. Last week we finished the first angel's message, and this week we are moving into the second angel's message, which is found in the book of Revelation chapter 14. And Frank, will you read for us the second angel's message? It's shorter than the first. Go ahead.
Well, it's basically one verse, verse 8. Another angel, a second, followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality.
Now, this sounds more like a statement than a message to deliver to people, but when we look at the totality of Scripture, we see that Babylon, that there's a connection to Babylon and a warning that is actually found in Revelation chapter 17 and Revelation chapter 18 as well. Let me, though, go to this first and let you know that when it's talking about Babylon in the book of Revelation, it's not speaking of a literal place. It's not speaking of the historical Babylon. When John wrote this, Babylon itself had been destroyed years and years before by the Medes and the Persians. So there was no longer a Babylon. Since then, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans had all come along. There was no actual Babylon. So Babylon symbolizes something else. And Revelation chapter 17, Frank, gives us an idea of what Babylon symbolizes. If you want to go there to Revelation chapter 17, why don't you read Revelation 17, verses 1 through 6.
All right. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers of the earth have become drunk. And he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled greatly.
Now, this is pretty intense,
Yes.
but let's break down a couple of things. First of all, in the Bible, especially in all the Bible, but in prophetic teaching, religious systems, religious entities are symbolized by the image of a woman. In Revelation chapter 12, the woman is a pure woman dressed in white, clothed with the sun. This symbolizes God's true people. In Revelation chapter 17, what we just read, there's another woman that is symbolized as scarlet. She is intentionally made to look very worldly, very maybe scandalous, we could say, but it is a religious system. That's one of the things we know based on the symbolism of prophecy, and generally this is agreed upon. So Babylon then represents a religious system.
Yes, contrasting
to God's system.
Yes.
And so we get that right off the bat. And the warning in Revelation chapter 14 is fallen is Babylon. And it tells us why Babylon is fallen. If we go there, what does it say? It says, For she who made all the nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. Frank, in the Bible, what does adultery or sexual immorality symbolize from a prophetic position?
Well, it symbolizes unfaithfulness to God, unfaithfulness to disregard of His commandments, and going your own way rather than following God's instructions. And it's interesting in the Old Testament, when we talk about Babylon, it's not just the city, but in the Old Testament and throughout the Bible, this city and this place and this name has become synonymous for a system, for something that is in opposition to God's people. Yeah. So the people of Israel were deported to Babylon. They lived in Babylon. Even earlier, you have.
Let's go to that first showing of it. Actually.
Okay.
Let's go to. It's in the book of Genesis, chapter 11, when the Babylon first comes on the scene. And we're told in verse 4, what does it say? It says, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and tower with its top to the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth."
Yeah, here you have the Tower of Babel, and it is built not because God commanded them to build this. It was kind of in defiance of what God commanded.
Like, try to send a flood to get us again. We'll.
Yes, and they for themselves, as the text says, and the thing is that this is the place and this is the moment where God confuses the languages. Yep. So Babylon really is a place of confusion. It's a place that is not doing God's will, but is doing their own thing.
Who's looking to honor themselves and lift up themselves. Yes. It says even here in verse 9 of Genesis 11, "Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth." Mm-hmm. So in other words, like the name actually Babylon is confusion, mm-hmm. right? It's a place of confusion. And so it's a system, it's a religious system. It's a religious system that is actually contrary to God's actual ideals. It's a system that's a religious system that is a system of confusion. The other thing that Revelation 14 tells us is that she made all the nations drink the wine of the passion of her. So it has a global...
and a political...
has a global and a political impact.
Yes, so it's connected with the leaders of the world, the decision makers of the world, and they are influenced by that, and they are basically under the control of it.
The false teachings, the apostasy, the heresies that she promotes. And we see all this in that one aspect. We go to Revelation 17, and it says similar in verse 2. This talks about the political power of this entity. You just referenced that, so why don't you show verse 2?
In verse 2 it says, "With whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk." So
the powers, the political powers of the earth are impacted by this, but so are everyday people. Mm-hmm. There's this power both in the both and. So this seems like a fallen religious system. Mm-hmm. It has an international reach. It influences people around the world with deceptions.
Yes. And if you go to verse 15 in chapter 17, the angel explains that a little further. And he says, "And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages." So there you have the global perspective as well.
Let's actually go back. Let's think more about what Babylon, so it represents confusion, represents these powers. When Babylon was actually a nation, we know several things about it. We know that it was very aggressive.
It was powerful. It was a ruling nation, and it conquered Jerusalem. It took the people of Israel.
Nebuchadnezzar, their most mighty king, was known as the Hammer. He destroyed and wiped out people and nations. Yeah. A very violent nation.
Yes.
We know also that Nebuchadnezzar said, "Look at this kingdom that I have built."
Became proud.
Proud. There was a level of pride, and authority. So we have all these things that Babylon represents. Now there's a warning that God gives to us, and we're going to touch more upon this power as we go along, and we'll talk about what we believe it represents. This Babylon power represents in a future episode. But I think the key, Frank, is there's something that God says that I want you to talk about in Revelation chapter 18, verse 4, and I want you to read that. It says, "After this I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, 'Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great,'" the same message that came from the second angel. "She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her." So there we have the universal totality. We have the deception of her teachings, along with her political power. And the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. There's an economic aspect to this power. And then verse 4.
"And I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues.'" You know, the scenery that we get here in broad strokes is that there is a religious system that is so influential, that is so powerful, that is so worldwide active, doing things with the leaders of the world, the political leaders of the world, and yet distorts the truth of the Bible and God's will. That a point comes, where God says it is no longer possible to reform that institution, let's say, that entity, and so that it becomes better. But the point comes where God says you have to come out of it. Yeah. So that's what I see. When this deception grows to a point that it is no longer redeemable. Yeah. If there is hope that you can change something within the context in which you live, you'll try to give it best and to make the best possible impact so that it can change for the better. Mm-hmm. But if that surroundings, if that entity has deteriorated to a point where it is no longer possible to reform it, then those who are still able to listen to God, who are receptive to his voice, they will no longer try to change things that cannot be changed, but they will leave that and follow him, and then emerges an alternative movement out of that.
Let me give you an illustration of this. God labors with this system, and God labors with the people within this system, desiring to, but there comes a point, like you said, where it's just not working. I had a Honda Accord. Now, I'm a Honda guy. I love my Hondas, but I always said I got the limit of all Hondas. And back in the day, I had this Honda, and it broke down on me so often. I was getting so frustrated with it always breaking down on me. And I would talk to my wife about it, and I would tell her, like, "Oh man, it's just I've got to get a new car." She'd say, "No, dude, let's just keep trying to work on it." We kept trying to work on it. One day I was driving down the road. This is a true story, Frank. I was driving down the road, and my car, I'd just gotten it fixed again, and I'm driving down the road, and this giant vulture, a vulture is a symbol of death, right? This giant vulture flies out of the air. I'm telling you, a giant vulture flies out of the air and hits my windshield and cracks my windshield all the way across, and my windshield wiper breaks off too with it, and it's flapping against my thing. And I'm thinking, this is ridiculous. And I decided right there, out loud, I said, "That's the sign. This car is dead. It's done." So I drove home, and I told my wife, "I'm going to get a new car." And she's like, "What?" I said, "Don't worry about it." She was half asleep because she was a nurse and she had worked the night before, so she didn't know what was going on for sure. I drove my car. Frank, I was 100 yards from the dealership, and my car broke down, and I coasted into the dealership. And I said, there's nothing else I can do. I had to, I tried to save that car so many times. It's like that where there's this laboring. I mean, I made it funny, but it's not funny in God's eyes, but God's laboring in but this system has just continued to move further and further away from God. It started out as a church. In fact, it's referenced here, the reference is somewhat in Revelation chapter 12 a little bit, where it talks about in Revelation 12, it says, then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. So in other words, out of this entity comes another offspring that is faithful to God, because this woman is no longer now faithful to God.
Now, here's a little message of hope as well. If you go to verse 4 that we read, this talks about Babylon. Yep. It talks about a fallen system. It talks about something that is not following God's rule and will, but influences others to do evil things. Yeah. Now, out of this, he says, come out of her, my people. Yes. So yes. That is significant in my eyes, because even though the system might be corrupt, yep, there are still people in the system that God calls my people. Yeah, yeah. So it's the message, whatever the message is about Babylon, it's not about individuals. Amen. It's about a system that has gone wrong, yep, and that is promoting things differently from what the gospel teaches us in the Bible.
And that's so important to make that point, because sometimes when we teach this, we can get very pointed and people can think that we're talking about the people. And what we're saying here is a system. The system is a system of confusion. The system has, the overall structure has created this, a system of false teachings, and has merged this idea of religion and political power, which should never be done. But it's not the people. Within that system, God still says, come out of her, my people. Yes. Someone over here in this pure white church, dressed in white with the sun, may say, oh, we're God's people. God doesn't have people anywhere else. But God says,
come out of her,
my people. Think about Jesus' words too. There's sheep, he says, that are not of this fold. Yes. He said, but the sheep hear my voice and know my voice. But the sheep are not of this fold. It's something always to remember, that just because a system is broken, or just because you're a part of the right system, does not mean, because let's face it, people could be by name in the right system and still not be the people of God. And people can be in a false system and still be the people of God.
It's not the church that saves you. Yes. Even though some churches claim that you have to be a member of that church in order to be saved. But the Bible, it's never the church that saves you, or you're belonging to a certain... It's your relationship to Jesus Christ that makes the difference. But that relationship to Jesus Christ, and that is an important point too, will lead you to a community of believers, of followers who have a desire to follow God's commandments and not disregard them, to do God's will and submit themselves fully to Him. Exactly. And so it leads into a new community of faith, basically. You cannot follow God, you cannot be a disciple of Jesus Christ just by yourself. You need to have a fellowship of other believers as well.
Frank, we're going to end it right there. I'm going to cut it right there. Some of you already know who Babylon is and what Babylon is, or the system that Babylon is, but we're going to come back and talk about it more next week when we look at the last message in the third angel's messages. Not the last message of our series of this season, but the last of the three angels' messages. And we're going to unpack more what this system is and why it's so important for us to heed this warning. From heaven itself, come out of her, my people. the system is broken, but God's people are still part of that. And God's calling all of us to come and to be connected fully to Him with all of our hearts and all of our minds. So we'll see you next week as we look at episode number 10, I think is next week. God bless. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.